Are we sure that the Jerusalem of today that we know with the Dome of the Rock, are we sure that's the real Jerusalem that Jesus walked around, or King David or Solomon? Do we actually believe that that is the real city? It is what we're told, but is it really the city of ancient Jerusalem? I just finished a video on the Letter of Aristeas from 250 BC, and it said that Jerusalem was surrounded by mountains, impregnable, almost difficult, very difficult to defeat in battle because of where it was situated. And then if we look at the Levant, we go, well, that doesn't sort of fit. And then we read also in that letter that the temple and the city of Jerusalem were built up very high. A mountain is what Aristeas called it 250 years before Christ, that it was built on a mountain and in a mountainous areas with agriculture, but a mountainous area. So I want to look at now at what the Bible says, because the Bible is actually quite clear, and I think we just don't read it. I think we just skip by these things, and we don't really pay attention and note the discrepancies in what we read to what the Bible lands of today give us. So as I go through these Bible accounts, just think, does this really apply to the Jerusalem of today in the Levant or Palestine area? Just at least think about it. Psalm 48, beautiful in elevation, the joy of the whole earth. Mount Zion in the far north, the city of the great king. So consider, I'm putting some pictures here of Jerusalem of today. And yes, there's a few hills around there, small hills. But beautiful in elevation, Jerusalem is not a high city, nor is it visible from far away. It is just a city like any other city, pretty much on a plain. But so we read beautiful in elevation, the joy of the whole earth. And yes, I mean, Jerusalem of today is beautiful in a sense, I suppose. But is it that astounding that it's the joy of the whole earth? Because from the writer of Psalms, their perspective is that Jerusalem is dramatically elevated. In 2 Samuel 5, if you go read that, you'll find that this city that David conquered from the Jebusites, it was very, very hard to conquer. David is hundreds of years after Joshua came into the countryside. So the Jebusites held on to that city for a long time, and even when it was conquered, they still lived among the people. But this city was impregnable. It was very difficult to conquer. And if you look at modern Jerusalem, it's just like any other rolling hill. I don't see any sign that it was impregnable or hard to conquer. So when David approached the Jerusalem to take it on from the Jebusites, they say, even the blind and lame can defend this city against you. Meaning it wouldn't take very, very many of us to take care of protecting our city against you. So these are not foolish people. These are warriors, experienced fighters in a fortified city. And they are so confident in their natural defenses that they mock a seasoned army approaching them. That confidence comes entirely from topography, or the lay of the land. And look at the Levant in Jerusalem today. Look at the Jerusalem we consider the Jerusalem of today. And look at it honestly. And look at the topography, or the layout of the land. And you can approach it from anywhere. There is no impregnable wall that approaching army couldn't conquer with enough numbers. In Psalm 46 it reads, the water, about the water. There's a river whose streams make glad the city of God. So it isn't just at one little spring dug down in a cave somewhere, like in modern Jerusalem. It says that they're basically gushing streams that make the city glad. Fountains of water, which we went over in that last letter from Greece 250 years before Christ, that there was water continually flowing through the temple, cleaning up the blood and all that kind of stuff. So where do we see that in the Levant of today, that dry land, where it barely has the Jordan River, as they call it? And I did a video on that because the Jordan River doesn't fit the Bible narrative any more than Jerusalem actually does. The entire documented history of the whole area we call Levant today, or Jerusalem today, is a history of carefully managed scarce water, a very dry, arid landscape. Whereas the Jerusalem we read about in the Letter of Aristeas and also here, the water was flowing naturally. It had huge springs, tons of water going through the city. Not just a little hole in the ground that they could go down to and get some water. No, this was gushing water enough to, as it said in the Letter of Aristeas, to clear out the blood of thousands of animals sacrificed on the holiday, the big days of feast days for Jerusalem. The next thing is in 1 Kings, the gold. We have to consider the gold. The land of the Levant that we have today has never been known for its gold. It has no gold mines. It's not a big producer of any real amount of anything, actually. It's a very dry, arid land. And it was never famous for mines like you find in Ethiopia and South Africa, or over in West Africa, or down in the Kenya area. No, because it just was what it was. So it's not known for its gold. When they're doing the archaeology there, they're not pulling up great finds of gold. It was a poor, poor land. It says that Solomon's annual gold income was 666 talents. I don't want to get into that number, I don't want to get into that number, which you'll see in Revelation. But it says that silver was so abundant that it was considered ordinary, like a stone, like almost of no value. So not even worth commenting on. There was that much gold around at the time of Solomon. And as I said, the Levant has no significant amount of any gold deposits or any other deposits of anything. But you'd have to go a long way to find gold-bearing land. So where did the gold come from for Solomon? So what if the Jerusalem we have of today is not the actual Jerusalem of Jesus' day, nor King David, or any other time? That this was built by Rome hundreds of years after Christ. I want to read some scriptures that have to do with Jerusalem, because for me, I'm not so certain that Jerusalem is where it is today, is the real Jerusalem that Jesus walked, or that King David built, or Solomon lived in. I want to look at some of these scriptures and just think about them, consider these scriptures, and maybe we can get an idea of where Jerusalem might have been, or what we should be looking for if we want to find the actual real Jerusalem long ago. In Psalm 125 it says, "And they that trust in the Lord shall be as Mount Zion, which cannot be removed, but abideth forever. As the mountains are round and about Jerusalem, so the Lord is round and about his people from henceforth, even forever." So think about the picture in your mind. Try to remove the Jerusalem of our day out of your mind for a minute, and think about what this Jerusalem that's described in Psalms is referring to, because it is quite specific. This Mount Zion is not just a teeny little hill that's part of Jerusalem of our day. It is a mount meaning mountain, Zion, and it must have been grand for people to be naming it as such rather than just a lowly hill. But the main thing here is it says the mountains are round about Jerusalem. There are no mountains around the Jerusalem of today at all. It is not, you cannot say there are mountains. There's not even really hills around it. It's sort of like rolling hills, but there's no mountains round about it. So think about that scripture. Let's move on to another. In Exodus 23, 28 to 29, one of the viewers on my last video mentioned this, and it's interesting. And this is in King James Version. "And I will send hornets before thee, and they shall drive out the Hivite, the Canaanite, and the Hittite from before thee. And I will not drive them out from before thee in 1 year, lest the land become desolate, and the beasts of the field multiply against thee." So there must have been a lot of animals there that could have taken over the land if the people were driven out of the land. And if we look around the Levant today, and anywhere outside of it, although if you want to go to the Negev desert or down towards Jordan or up towards Syria, the last thing you're going to find is animals, wildlife coming in to take over the land if people weren't there. Right now in our day, if people weren't there, without the irrigation, it would go back to being a desert with very few animals. So what does this scripture talk about? Wild animals coming in and taking out the people. And in 1 Samuel 14 we read, "And all the people of the land came to a wood, and there was honey upon the ground." Well, that is an African thing. That is not honey falling out of the trees and onto the ground. That is an African thing. That never happens. There's no place in Jerusalem of our day or that whole area where this happens. "And when the people were come into the wood, behold, the honey dropped, but no man put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the oath." And we can look at this one, the animals of the Bible. Gavest thou the goodly wings unto the peacocks, or wings and feathers unto the ostrich? Ostriches do not live, never have lived, in the Levant, north of Egypt. It is not a place for ostriches, okay? Nor are there peacocks living there naturally either. Even the sea monsters draw out the beast, and they give suck to their young ones. The daughter of my people is become cruel, like the ostriches in the wilderness. So how you have to ask yourself, so how did the people, why do the prophets comment about ostriches and peacocks? I mean, they also talk about lions and bears and leopards and jaguars and snakes and crocodiles and all of those kind of things. And then you look at the Levant and you go, okay, so tell me where we find those animals. Like literally ostriches, peacocks, crocodiles. Yes, there were crocodiles in the Nile, but that's a couple 100 miles away. But where are these animals? These mammoth beasts, and the behemoth and the leviathan, and all the different things that we read about. And in Jeremiah 9:11, it says, "And I will make Jerusalem a heap of ruins." A heap of ruins. And I'm going to read about what Josephus said about Jerusalem actually after the Romans were done with it. But I will make Jerusalem a heap of ruins, a haunt of jackals, and I will lay waste the towns of Judah, so no one can live there. So should we be expecting, that's one of the things I want you to think about, should we be expecting people to be living in Jerusalem? Because it was destroyed, and as were all the cities of Judah destroyed. And in Jeremiah 7, I will bring an end to the sounds of joy and gladness, and to the voices of the bride and the bridegroom in the towns of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem, for the land will become desolate. And I think that's a key thing for us to consider. The area that we call Jerusalem today has not been desolate. It hasn't. It was a Roman fort before Helena of Rome got there. We'll talk about her in a minute. But it was not desolate. And with jackals, jackals don't live in that area of the world. Jackals live in Africa, as do lions. Now, some people will say, oh yeah, there were lions thousands of years ago in the area of the Levant in Palestine. And maybe there were a couple around in there. I'm not going to say there weren't. But just look at the land. I'll show you some pictures, but just look at the land that's around Jerusalem and think to yourself, okay, so how did lions live there? Lions have to eat other animals, large animals, and they have to eat fairly consistently. So where are the lions feeding on? They have to have the game living there. And for the game to be living there for the lions, there has to be grass and huge grasslands to have the numbers that are needed, which is why when hunters go hunting, and even in our day, and all through the colonial period, where do they go? They go to Africa. Yes, some go to India to hunt. A few go to America, I suppose, for a few things. But where's the big hunting area in the world? It is Africa, always has been. In my opinion, all the way from the Tower of Babel, which in one of my videos, I place the Tower of Babel between the White and the Blue Nile, somewhere down in in Sudan, near that area of below Egypt. It's called Kush lands or Kushite lands or Nubia. But the point is, to be great hunters, you have to have game to hunt. And Jerusalem was known to have lions around it. We read of the prophets, and I'm going to get into that one in a second, but we read of prophets being killed by the lions. But remember that there are a lot of scriptures about this Jerusalem becoming a desolation. And what do we read that the Savior said? And I think that's key, because you could say these scriptures of Jeremiah are applying to the time of Babylon when it was conquered, but then they went back and resettled it again. But with the coming of Rome, the area of Judea and Jerusalem were conquered again. But this time, the people were taken out of the land completely. Millions died in the war, and those that were left were taken away. And Jesus, when he wept over Jerusalem, and he said that there would be no stone left one upon another. We're going to talk about what Josephus said about that, because that is exactly what came to pass. It was left completely desolate. And so these scriptures we read, the holy cities are a wilderness, Zion is a wilderness, Jerusalem a desolation. Should we be finding, my opinion is, Jerusalem has never been found Again, some of my viewers believe that the people that run the world already know where Jerusalem was originally, and possibly they do in the archives. But the reality is we don't know. I don't know where exactly it is. I have some guesses, and I'm going to do that later in this video or another video. But the issue is, do we know if it's taking its Sabbaths and Jerusalem is hidden and was completely destroyed in a desolate, a place for jackals, then what should we expect to find there? Owls and jackals? Nothing. Just uninhabited wilderness. That's what we should expect, in my opinion, for Jerusalem, and likely most of Judea, at least to some degree, compared to what it was. In Micah, it says in 3:12, "Therefore shall Zion for your sake be plowed as a field, and Jerusalem shall become heaps, and the mountain of the house as the high places of the forest." It's just going to be a mountainous heap. If you went to a mountain range, I don't know Africa that well, of course, but if I go to anywhere, I've been all over South America, North America, and I've been in the mountains hiking many times. And what do you see underneath the mountains? You see heaps of rubble that have fallen down, scree slopes they call them, that have fallen down off the mountains. And you can sort of run down them, ski down them if you want to, but they're just piles, heaps of rubble. And if a city was completely destroyed that was near a mountain, it could be just heaps of rubble. The forest could be grown over it, and we just don't know. Jerusalem to this day could be very much hidden, taking its Sabbaths. In Psalms 48 it says, "Great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised, the city of our God, in the mountain of his holiness." Again, this mountain, not a little hill that's a few hundred feet higher than every other little hill that's around. No, they're using the term mountain. The mountain of his holiness. Beautiful for situation. The joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion, on the sides of the north, the city of the great king. Okay, so think about that again. Think about it. I try, as a little child, to picture in your mind what that means about Jerusalem of our day. Picture what it says, beautiful for situation. So it's not just a little rolling hill, like every other little rolling hill in the world. The joy of the whole earth. So it has to be very much lifted up, very beautiful, very distinctive compared to any other place. Is Mount Zion, on the sides of the north, the city of the great king, whether that be David or in the future of the Messiah. In Zechariah 8 it says, "And thus saith the Lord, I am returned unto Zion, and will dwell in the midst of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem shall be called a city of truth, and the mountain of the Lord of hosts, and the holy mountain." So again, as I put pictures here of Jerusalem, picture yourself, where is the mountain? Where is this mountain of joy and gladness, the beauty of the whole earth? I'll put some pictures of some mountains all over the world. And yes, there's some beautiful ones. And yes, they are the beauty of the whole earth, whether they be in Africa or North America or over in Nepal. Beautiful, huge mountains. That's what a mountain is. Hills are hills, and hills usually are rounded. There are some mountains that are still huge but are more rounded. But most mountains we picture have peaks, right? Then they go down and down and down and extend out. Whether it's a volcano, that type of mountain, or the other kinds of mountains that were pushed up. But mountains are still mountains. I think if you asked any 10-year-old what a mountain is, to pick out a picture of a mountain, they're not going to pick a hill like we see Jerusalem of today built upon. No, I think it would be built upon a mountain, and distinct and beautiful for it. And Judges 14:8-9 it says, "And after a time he returned to take her, and he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion, and behold, there was a swarm of bees and honey in the carcass of the lion. And he took thereof in his hands, and went on eating, and came to his father and mother, and he gave them, and they did eat. But he told them not that he had taken the honey out of the carcass of a lion." So to have a lion carcass, which means a dead lion, where did the lion come from? Egypt didn't have lions. Levant didn't have lions. We don't read of lions living along the Nile in the days of the kings of the pharaohs. Now, did they bring in some lions? Probably they did from Africa or further south in Africa. But lions can't live in the desert. Lions have to feed, like I said. So for a lion carcass to be there, then that means lions live there. And for honeybees to be making honey in the carcass of a lion and using it to make honey, that has to mean honeybees. And honeybees need flowers and vegetation, a lot of it. And as we read in that Letter of Aristeas, it said that there were huge groves of olives all over Judea, tons of olive groves, tons of fruit trees, tons and tons of crops and lands and agriculture. Well, that's what you need if you want to have bees, and great quantities of bees. And even in today, they go up the trees. I'll try to show a picture here, and there's huge formations of honey in the trees that drips down onto the ground. In 1 Kings 13, we know this story. And when he was gone, a lion met him by the way and slew him. And his carcass was cast in the way, and the ass stood by it, and the lion also stood by the carcass. And behold, the men passed by and saw the carcass cast in the way, and the lion standing by the carcass. So again, this story of the prophet being killed by the lion. But lions, in order to be killed by a lion, there have to be lions living there. We just can't see. We have, as I've said in other videos, we have these blinders on because we have been taught that this land is Zion, or this land is Jerusalem, and this land is Judea, and this land is Canaan. And yet, what do we see? It doesn't make sense. Even as I mentioned in the last video, the Letter of Aristeas, he said that the land, when he went to Judea, this is after Babylon, but the still remaining kingdom of Judea, okay, just before Christ, was about 93 or 94,000 square miles. That's a big place. Not as big, that's like the size of Colorado, but it's not the size of all of Kenya. It's only half the size of Kenya. But it is a big place. But if we look at the Levant, Israel, and what we call Israel or Palestine today, it is 8,000 square kilometers. It is teeny, like teeny, teeny. And just because we've been told by Rome that that is the place. So let's get into that. I want to talk about Helena of Rome. I think the Helena of Rome issue is so crucial to this. We don't think about this. But Jesus, or the Son, whichever you prefer to call him, I don't use the other Yah words. He, what? And his 12 apostles were what? They were of Judea, which means they were of the 12 tribes, which means they were of that nation. Of course, we know that. When the church first started, that we call today, I suppose, Christianity, but before Christianity, they had the Ebionites, the people that followed the 12 in Jerusalem, were Hebrews. They kept the Hebrew feast days, just as Jesus did. They kept the Sabbath on the lunar Sabbath. They kept all the things that were in the Bible. They read the Torah. They read Moses. That's what they had. They didn't have a Bible like we have in our day. Not until later when people recorded the words of Jesus. But they were Hebrews. They were not Greeks and Romans. They were Hebrews. And yet this Ebionite church, the first church of the 12 apostles, they were destroyed. They were wiped out, gone. They were considered, even a few hundred years later, as heretics and cast aside. Because as the church became more Greek and more Roman, so by 70 AD, when Jerusalem was destroyed, they carried away, they wiped out all of the Hebrews. They were wiped out. Yes, we read that some of the Christians, if you want to call that, or the Ebionites, some of them escaped away. We do know that. But the whole country was cleaned out, completely destroyed. And we're going to read about what Josephus says about Jerusalem. But it was destroyed completely. And we don't understand that the people, as this new religion was founded by Paul and into the churches, into Christianity, the Ebionites and the way of the 12 apostles was pushed aside. The Hebrews were rooted out of the church. They were pushed aside. When you look at the people that went to make the new Roman Christianity, or the Roman Church in 325, in that range, who were they? They were Greeks. They were Romans. They were not Hebrews, right? They weren't. The church by that time was completely a Gentile church. Then they just argued about doctrines, and they brought in trinities and all kinds of new things, and they fought about what should be kept and what not. And they merged the religion of Rome, which was Mithraism, or a pagan religion, with a trinity, and they merged that into Christianity and made one church, one Holy Roman Empire, out of 2 or 3 or 5 different things, or 10 different things. But they merged in and made one, and everything that wasn't part of that was cast aside. But who was most cast aside? And I'm going to make this point really clearly, especially for you in Africa. Who was most cast aside? The Judeans. Okay, the people that actually were converted by the 12 among the Hebrews, they were cast aside, completely gone. They were not there. They were cast out. So you think that Rome, when they made this new place, you think that Rome, when they took on this new religion, and they literally had just destroyed Judea and Jerusalem, and they hated the people. So can we believe that they then said, oh, let's go make Jerusalem the holy place, and let's go call these things, and they're going to go down into Africa, where I believe Jerusalem actually is found when we do find it. But do you think that they would go there and go, oh, here it is down among all these great African people? Do you think here's the real Jerusalem, and here's no? They made a Hollywood or a Disneyland, in my opinion. And Helena, the mother of Constantine, the emperor's mother, she went and took a pilgrimage to what we call the Holy Land today. And when she was there, she said she had visions and dreams, and she went around naming all the places. The fort that was there, I'll show you that, Heliocopione or something like that, had a name, I can't remember the name, but they changed that fort into Jerusalem and renamed the fort city to be Jerusalem. She then pointed out, this is Golgotha, this is Golgotha, this is Bethlehem, this is Mount Sinai. So she traveled all over the place and picked out different places. And over time, and over the next century, they picked out more places until they basically filled out a land and named the places we have in the Bible today. So the Jerusalem of today doesn't fit. And I want to get into that because we come upon an archaeological problem with Jerusalem. Not that there isn't some ruins there, because there are ruins there. But when these people, I'm going to put a few of their quotes here as I'm talking, but as these people went, that are scholars and archaeologists, went and dug up Jerusalem at the time of David and Solomon, that time, 900, 1000 BC, what do they find? What were they expecting to find, What were they expecting to find? They were expecting to find a city that could host, 1,000 wives and concubines for Solomon, and this great kingdom of David that we read about in the Bible. And what do they find? They find a place that has a few hundred people, a very poor town, and they say, well, then David and Solomon were just chieftains and they made up the Bible accounts later on. Because what else could they do? They come upon the facts on the ground. In the ground, the Jerusalem they find is what? It's a Jerusalem of 700, 500, 1,200 people. No palaces, no grand buildings, no temple, no nothing. All they find is this very poor, rugged hilltop town. And yet they've been given the blinders, like all of us have, that this is Jerusalem. So rather than taking the pin in our map that we have in our phones today and going, maybe that pin isn't Jerusalem, maybe we've got this misnamed. So rather than do that, they take Jerusalem and leave the pin in there, but then say the Bible is unreliable and David and Solomon were not these people at all. That never happened. Moses never happened. The Sinai never happened. Because as they find there's no evidence, no walls in Jericho that came down at the time of Joshua, then they have to go, well, then the whole Bible's sort of mythical, but we'll say that there's some fact in it, but it's really just mythical. And instead of taking that pin, take that pin and put it in the map, where? Somewhere in Africa, I believe. You could even put it somewhere in Saudi Arabia if that's where you believe. But take that pin and put it somewhere else and let the Bible speak. Because if you put that pin, in my opinion, whether you put it in South Africa, West Africa, in the Kenya area, Ethiopia, there is tons of room for the whole Bible narrative to then have breathing room and come to pass. The 25 to 35 nations around Jerusalem, and the mountains, and the honey, and the animals, and the wildlife, and the agriculture, and the cattle, and the land, and a Sea of Galilee that could actually have waves that would swamp a boat. Once you take away the names and the places that Helena of Rome gave us, then go, okay, well, maybe that was a mistake. Maybe they did something there. And the true Bible lands are all in Africa. And everything that happened in the Bible was in Africa. And then you can go, okay, then that frees me up to take a look at other things like, where was Babel and Babylon really? Where was Assyria really? Doesn't mean there wasn't a Sumer in the Mesopotamia and all those things. Because there are ruins up in Mesopotamia, of course there are. But that land was at the border of Ham's lands and Japheth's lands. Turkey is part of what we consider Japheth's lands. So the people that were living in Mesopotamia were most likely of Japheth, or possibly of Ham, because Ham had the hot and cold countries, North Africa, the Horn of Africa, and up into the Middle East. But Shem had the land, the cool land, the land that was neither hot or cold, as it says in Jubilees. And it was on the equator, in the center of the world. The apple, as Noah said, the apple of his eye, the beautiful land. And that is the land, in my opinion, that Canaan stole. So if we want to find the true Jerusalem, the real Jerusalem one day, we have to take that pin out of where we think Jerusalem is and what we've been taught and what Rome gave us, and go back to the scriptures and read the scriptures and read what has been said. And then maybe we can start to find where we can stick that pin that works and fits the narrative of the Bible. I am certain once we figure it out, and I know all my viewers and myself and many others in all kinds of channels are trying to figure this out. And it's not easy because we don't have that many hints. There's just some hints and some things. But when we find it, it'll all make sense. I want to move on to Josephus. I've done a video on this. I'll leave a link to that as well. But Josephus, who lived at the time, wrote for the Romans, but he lived at the time and he was Jewish. And he wrote a very accurate, his writings are used by scholars for their accuracy. The only thing that scholars don't believe, one of the things they don't believe and thinks that he was exaggerating or not telling the truth, was about Jerusalem. Because he said, I'm going to put the quote here, but to paraphrase it, he said that when they dug up the city, this is the Romans after conquering Jerusalem, when they dug up the city, they didn't just turn over every stone, as Jesus has said. They turned up every foundation in the whole city, except for a tower. Other than that, they tore the city to shreds to the foundation. So how do we have ruins that they're digging up now in Jerusalem? And how do we have wailing walls and all those things if they did not leave one stone upon another? It was not just the temple. That's what we are told. But that's not what Josephus said. He said they tore up the whole city down to the foundation. And he said that a person could not ever tell that human beings had ever lived there before. That's how great the destruction was. They could not tell. It was a desolation. It was a desolation for owls and jackals and animals of the forest. There was nothing left. It was desolate, removed even from memory, destroyed. And what were we given by Rome? We were giving a new Jerusalem, a new fort that could be turned into a Jerusalem, a new lake or sea that could be called the Sea of Galilee, a new river to be called the Jordan River. And we could make things try to fit. And a Sinai in this teeny little desert area with no water, where there's no ruins, no sign that any hundreds of thousands or a million people came through the Sinai Peninsula, as they call it. So we have to look at these things. But Josephus gives us a great key, because he says that the city was there was no one there. No people could go back and live in that city. It was gone. destroyed to the foundation. I want to comment, this is for my viewers that get this far and the people that love following this kind of stuff about Africa. We're in Africa, which is a huge land, 3 times larger than the United States or more. It's a huge land. I've shown this map. I'll put it up. I like putting this one up. But just think about it. Some people think that they were in South Africa, Namibia. Others think more over towards another part of South Africa, Lesotho, in that area. And others think it's up in the mountains of the Rwenzori Mountains. And others think it's in, like myself, I believe probably more like Mount Kenya, southern Sudan, that area, South Ethiopia. Others think it's in Ethiopia itself. Others think it's in West Africa. Some others think it's in the Congo area or Democratic Republic of Congo. Who knows? I don't know. And I don't want to tell you that I know. But I would love you to all that are watching to please comment where you think the Jerusalem is. For me, my gut instinct, because I just did the video on the Jordan River being possibly the Omo River going into Lake Turkana on the border of Kenya, then I can see Mount Kenya, that whole area, being that area. But I don't have proof of it. But there are mountains all around that land. And the Letter of Aristeas that I read, it fits in very well with that area as well. But whatever area you think is viable, please comment. But I want us to be honest even with ourselves. If you're in South Africa and South African and you see these names on maps, and we see Jerusalem, or we see there's at least 10 or 12 different Bathsheba, different places that are named Bible names in South Africa area, Namibia area. But think to yourself, those names, those maps are 300 or 400 years old. Yes, they can be a clue, but they aren't evidence. They are only a clue to maybe point in a direction to look at something. But we have to take all the facts, all the things that it says in the Bible about the mountains and being surrounded by mountains, and the Jordan River and the size of it, that the prophet could float an axe head, lose an axe head, and go and float it, and the water was stood up, and that type of thing. We have to look at all the evidence and try to put it together and see if the area we think is the actual area is the area of Israel or Judah at the time. I also want to make this caveat. It's very important. I've done it in other videos, but I need to make this point. For those that are of Shem, which is most of sub-Saharan, that colonial term again, sub-Saharan Africa, that are mostly Shem, remember that if we use the Septuagint timeline, from the time of Shem to the time of Moses is 1,400 years more or less. Not the 200 years that's in our Bibles, 1,400 years. Not the 200 to 600 years that's in our Bibles, but 1,400 years. Moses came into the land, a land already filled with Shem, already with thousands of languages, already with huge nations, all the way, in my opinion, from South Africa to West Africa, all through. And where do we think that Israel then went when they came with Moses? They came down with 500,000 to 2 million people. We don't really have the exact number, but let's say it's 2 million people. But how many people do I think were living in Africa at the time? If they'd been there for 1,400 years, that many generations, I believe there was probably already 100 million at least living in Africa at the time, and that's just a guess. But there were lots of people. We read about 25 nations just around where Judea was. The Moabites, the Ammonites, the Jebusites, all these different peoples we read around, the Cushites, the Egyptians, the Babylonians. We read about all these peoples. These peoples had to have, they had 1,400 years to flourish as great nations. So when Moses and Joshua brought the people in, they didn't bring it into an empty land. They came, as soon as they came out of, in my opinion, the Green Sahara, down in Sudan and down through Sudan or Mali, Sudan, that area, and down towards Kenya, what were they running up against? It says they ran up against giants. They ran up against huge walled cities, so much that the spies were terrified. They ran up against civilization. So they didn't, and so for those that are in South Africa, please, and I'm not putting down your ideas, but please explain or think about how did the people get to South Africa? That's thousands of miles to cross through lands that were already inhabited to get down there. Because we think because the Bible timeline was changed by the Pharisees, we think that there was only 200 years from Abraham to Shem, in their lives. And so there was these teeny little nations, there wasn't much, so the land was more or less empty. But if there's 1400 years, as the Septuagint says, which is the Bible or the Old Testament that Jesus and his apostles used, was the Septuagint, because we can see word for word where they quote it. So that is what they were using for Scripture, and that's the timeline they were using. And we see that in Luke. I'll show that here. But the Pharisees took out Canaan out of the timeline, and they took out 1400 years out of the timeline, or 1300, a long time. But by doing that, they shortened everything, and they made these nations impossible to find. So as you in South Africa are looking at this, and I really would love you to please get back to me on your ideas, because I'm not saying it's not in South Africa, but I don't believe that the kingdoms of Judah and Israel were any larger, in my opinion, than what is Kenya of our day. No larger than that. I don't think it was the whole African continent was all Israel. It doesn't make logical sense, not even slightly to me. Now, does that mean that they couldn't have moved down to South Africa? I'm not saying that. But we have to have a reasonable discussion about how did that happen. And if you believe they're over in the Congo, how did they get there? Where are the mountains? Where are the streams? Where are the rivers? Where are the salt lakes and the different things, the Dead Sea type thing? We have to find those things. We have to have the Sodom and Gomorrah type ruins. And we have to find, if we believe the Bible to be historical, we have to be willing to toss aside all our own ideas, even if we're in Africa. And for my African friends, put your ideas in a bowl or put them aside for a minute and analyze as much as we can where this land might be. That doesn't mean that if you're in South Africa or you're in West Africa that you are not of Israel. No, because Israel was destroyed and the people were carried away and taken away and killed and, conquered multiple times by Assyria, by Babylon, and scattered and scattered and scattered. So I wouldn't expect to find them in the actual land. I'd be surprised, except for a few. But that doesn't mean that you aren't of Israel wherever you live. But we're talking about the actual land, not where the people that feel they are Israel today, whether you're Bantu, Igbo, or Yoruba, or Ibu, or Yoruba, or Iwe, or all the different groups. That isn't the same thing. Finding out who you are is one thing. Finding where the land originally was that Rome destroyed, that's another thing. Because I wouldn't expect, as I said, to find your ancestors on that land, because they were taken away. And then the land, I assume, was filled up with other peoples that moved in from the surrounding areas. And we read in this Letter of Aristeas that the people that already moved in and had encroached on the land, and I'll show that here, and also I'll show again that scripture that just said that if we move the people all out of the land quickly, then what'll happen? Wild animals will come in and take over the land. So they had to move the people out slowly as they conquered the land. So it didn't become a wild range like we see in parts of Africa again. And so try to help me on this. I would appreciate it. I really would like you. It's not my Jerusalem, it's your Jerusalem. And I would like it to be found one day, and I'm sure you would be as well. But I think if we're going to find it, it's going to be a group effort. And I think if everybody can just look at it and think about, and I'd like to hear any facts from where you are. If you're in Namibia, tell me why you think that it's in that desert, in that place in Namibia, is where the ruins of Jerusalem are. Was it built on a mountain? Do those scriptures actually fit? Because that's the only way we'll get to the bottom of this, is we put our own ego aside and look at the facts, look at the reality on the ground, and try to find the real Jerusalem. My opinion, for me, that's just my opinion, is that it's probably somewhere, like I said, South Ethiopia, South Sudan, or near the Kushite lands, somewhere in the Kenya area, the Uganda area, in that area. That's my opinion for where the land is. Where the people are, I know there's maps in West Africa showing the kingdom of Judah or Judah, and I know they went all the way even into the Americas. They were scattered everywhere. I believe they're in India. I believe they're in China. I believe they're in Australia. I believe they're all over the place because they were scattered, which was the promise of Abraham, that his seed would be among the nations of the world, to be the leaven of the world. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed that, and please comment and let me know your thoughts on Jerusalem and where that might be in your opinion. Here's a video I just finished on the. Here's a video that I think is worthwhile if you really like this subject on this Letter of Aristeas. It's very fascinating. It's fascinating if you want to go through that. And here's another video I think you might enjoy. Anyway, take care. Thanks for watching, and have a good day.